Good evening. I hope this video finds you all well and in good health and in good spirits. Topic and title of this video is why behavioral analysis needs to be recast for the 21st century. Okay, let me begin this video by discussing what behavioral analysis is. Behavioral analysis is the scientific study of behavior focusing on understanding, predicting, and potentially changing how individuals act. Okay, behavioral analysis is a natural science. It's rooted in the concept and tradition of behaviorism. This is a very important branch of psychology that emphasizes the impact of environmental factors, including social and cultural factors, on behavior through learning principles such as reinforcement, which can be either positive or negative, and punishment, which is generally seen to be negative. Okay, this also includes it within its ambit and purview applied behavioral analysis or ABA, which takes these principles and applies them to address socially important behaviors, such as those related to autism and other developmental disabilities. Okay, therefore, applied behavioral analysis is a therapy based on the science of learning and behavior. It focuses on using principles of behavior to improve socially significant behaviors such as communication and social skills, in order to enhance positive outcomes and positive behavioral outcomes and diminish the relative role played by negative outcomes. Okay. Peer applied behavioral analysis originally began through the work of O. Ivar Lovas or Ole Ivar Lovas. He is a very important psychologist and has become a prominent uh, approach in education therapy and other fields. Ole Ivar Lovas was a Norwegian American clinical psychologist and professor. As is obvious, America in the early 20th century was the breeding ground, fertile breeding ground for scientists of all hues and colors. Though scientists themselves came from European and other traditional backgrounds, we need to make sure that the output of Indian scientists also increase. Okay, and behavioral analysis also helps improve the emotional quotient of individual, which is also known as emotional intelligence. It refers to the ability to understand, use, and manage emotions in positive ways to relieve stress, communicate effectively, empathize with others, and overcome challenges, and to diffuse conflicts and other things. Okay, it involves being aware of one's own emotions and the emotions of other people, and in order to use that awareness to guide one's own thinking and behavioral patterns. Okay, and autism need not be explained here. It's a neurophysical disorder, different difficulties in social communication, etc. If you see the history of behavioral analysis is rooted in the development of behaviorism, which is an important school of thought in psychology that focuses on observable behaviors rather than internal mental states. Okay, key figures like Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, Edward Thorndike, and B. F. Skinner laid the groundwork for the field, and the research led to the understanding of classical and operant conditioning. Okay, Ivan Pavlov was a Russian and Soviet experimental neurologist and psychologist known for his discovery of classical conditioning through experiments with dogs. Okay, Pavlov also conducted significant research on the psychology of digestion, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Psychology in 1904. Okay, John B. Watson or John Brothers Watson was an American psychologist who popularized the scientific theory of behaviorism, establishing it as a key and important psychological school. Edward Lee Thorndike was another eminent American psychologist who spent his entire career at Teachers College in Columbia University, and his work on comparative psychology and the learning process led to the theory of connectionism, and it helped lay the scientific foundation of educational psychology. Berners Frederick Skinner was another American psychologist. He was a behaviorist, inventor, and social philosopher. He was Edgar Pierce Professor of Psychology at Harvard University from 1948 till his retirement in 1974. B.F. Skinner developed behavioral analysis, especially the philosophy of radical behaviorism, and founded the experimental analysis of behavior, a school of experimental research psychology. He also used the concept and technique of operant conditioning to analyze and investigate human behavior. What is operant conditioning? Operant conditioning, also known as instrumental conditioning, is a learning process in which voluntary behaviors are modified by association with the addition or removal, as the case may be, of reward or aversive stimuli, positive or negative stimuli. The frequency of duration of the behavior may increase through reinforcement or decrease through punishment or extinction. Okay. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning are two fundamental types of learning, but they differ in how behaviors are required. Classical conditioning involves learning through associations between stimuli, where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with an unconditioned stimulus to elicit a conditioned response. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, focuses on learning through the consequences of behavior using reinforcement as a punishment to shape voluntary actions. Operant conditioning is also based on the law of effect, which is also known as Thorndike's law. It's a psychology principle advanced by Thorndike in 1898 on the matter of behavioral conditioning. This theory states that responses that produce a satisfying effect in a particular situation become more likely to occur again in that situation, and responses that produce a discomforting effect become less likely to occur again in that situation. Okay, if you look at the detailed history of behavioral studies, the early roots began in the early 1900s. Behaviorism's emergence coincides with John B. Watson, who is considered the father of behaviorism. He also had classical conditioning, as I told you, and the law of effect, and operant conditioning and radical behaviorism, which took place between the 1930s and 1950s. Okay, B.F. Skinner expanded on Thorndike's work and he developed the concept of operative conditioning, which emphasized the roles of reinforcement and punishment in shaping behavior. He also had radical behaviorism. B.F. Skinner introduced the concept of radical behaviorism, which acknowledges the influence of private events such as thoughts and feelings, while still emphasizing the importance of observable behaviors. The next phase, which began in the 1960s, is the development of applied behavioral analysis. This is based on Ivor Lova's work. His research on the 1960s demonstrated the effectiveness of intensive ABA interventions in teaching language and other skills. Other journals, such as the Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis or JABA, began to be instituted. Okay, continued growth and evolution has occurred since the 70s and 80s, and key concepts such as reinforcement, punishment, extension, shaping, etc., were introduced. Okay, and the key aspects of behavioral analysis include understanding behavior. This identifies and involves identifying factors that influence and shape behavior, including biological, pharmacological, and experimental factors, among other things. It involves prediction of behavior, analyzing patterns and trends in behavior to anticipate future actions, control of behavior, applying techniques such as behavioral principles to modify change behavior, often in therapeutic conditions, experimental analysis of behavior, EAB. This focuses on laboratory based research to understand the fundamental processes of behavior, often using animal models. And the applications of behavioral analysis, of course, are used for education, organization, behavioral management, health and fitness, security, marketing, therapy for autism, therapy for disabilities. However, this is not understood from a cross-cultural perspective. Okay, cross-cultural perspective is slanting because most research has been Eurocentric. That is what we have been harping on for the past 20 years. Okay, therefore, cross-cultural slant is required, and rather alarmingly and rather I mean, disgustingly, efforts have been made to study the behavioral patterns of primates and other animals, but little of other social and cultural groups. If this is not Eurocentrism, what is it? Can you tell me, please? Okay, this has become some kind of a Procrustean bed, a rigid framework that must be got rid of because they're not even bothered about other cultures. They're not even bothered about analyzing differences in variables between culture and culture, and to help sure that make sure that other cultures catch up. Okay, at least if they don't catch up, at least a proper analysis of other cultures needs to be done. Okay, now coming back to the concept of Procrustean bread, the term originates from the Greek myth of Procrustes, a bandit who would force travelers to fit his bed by either stretching those too short or cutting off the limbs of those too tall. This is a rude and crude way of equalizing. Okay, and this kind of Eurocentrism has marred many disciplines. For example, just to shoot off the hip, we have concepts such as Phillips curve and Say's laws. The Say's law that cannot be easily ratified. They're, as a matter of fact, obsolete. They should have been declared obsolete for the meeting itself and non-status. Okay, Phillips curve supposedly represents the relationship between the rate of inflation and unemployment rate, and it's an important concept in economics based on A.W.H. Phillips' study of wage inflation and unemployment in the UK. Say's law, the theory of Say's law, which says the supply creates its own demand, is obsolete. Okay, it has been uh, what do you say, overridden by theories that were developed during the time of the Depression by John Maynard Keynes and others. Okay, therefore, theories of cultural change itself are rooted in Marxist and other thoughts are obsolete. We have developed the concepts of symbiotic approach to social cultural change. This needs to be understood at all time to understand how cultures change from time to time. Diachronic extensions to symbiotic approach of social change also we had proposed. We had laid bare the difference between synchronic and diachronic approaches. Synchronic means at the same time, spatial. Okay, diachronic means temporal. Okay, we are also propose the horizontal, vertical, and lateral factors model to understand socio-cultural stage. We had also stated the importance of enculturation. Enculturation is a process by which people learn the dynamics of the surrounding culture and acquire values and norms appropriate or necessary for the culture and its worldviews. In case of acculturation, which is different from enculturation, two or more cultures are that are involved, namely the host culture and the base culture or the original culture. We also have concepts such as endo, meso, and exo environment, and we also have ethnography of enculturation. We need to use ethnographic practices. That's what I've been harping on ad nauseum for a long time now. We also have transculturation, where two cultures merge up to a certain point, but not more than that. This term was first coined and proposed by the anthropologist Fernando Ortiz. Okay, merging and converging cultures up to a certain point only. We are also proposed the concept of masculturation, which is so essential to understand in the 21st century, where we have social media, etc. And we also need proper social cultural design. This must be done in the true spirit of the term. We need emic perspectives. Okay. Emic perspectives, person culture looking at itself from its own perspective. Ethic is uh, from a third party lens, and ethmic is a harmonious blend between the two. The terms emic and ethic were coined by linguist Kenneth L. Pike in 1954, and he derived them from the linguistic terms phonemic and phonetic. Okay. Pike used these terms to analyze language, and they were later adapted to anthropology to describe perspectives, different perspectives studying culture. We had also proposed different concepts such as diverse emic, diverse ethic. Okay, different types of emic concept perspectives, different types of ethic perspectives. Representative emic sample, representative ethic sample, which is representative of all the major and significant emic or ethic viewpoints. Non-representative emic or ethic, ethic sample, the terms are self-explanatory. Typical emic viewpoint, typical emic viewpoint, and the typical are the most common and widespread emic or ethic viewpoints. One-sided emic view or one-sided ethic view. Okay, non-typical emic view or non-typical ethic view, also known as atypical emic view and atypical ethic view. Individual versus cultural ethnic. Individual means you take the viewpoint of only a small sample or a single individual. Neuremic or neuretic is based on concept of marginal native and professional stranger, where a researcher readily absorbs himself in the culture of subject being studied, becomes one of the people and mingles freely with them. Okay. Another meaning of the study of people by peoples of researchers who possess simpler cultural attributes. For example, Indian studies such as T.N. Madan, S.C. Dubey, D.N. Majumdar, M.N. Srinivas, and others have carried out neuremic studies. They're similar to Kadagacha, but however, they have not freed themselves from a Western mold completely, and it does not satisfy the principle of pragmatism and not certainly the principle of practicalism, because we need to have ethnography, action, anthropology to improve the lives of people. This was never done. It was just some kind of intellectual curiosity to study marginalized people or quaint exotic cultures. Okay, that obsolete, that viewpoint is obsolete at this point in time. We also have the concept of biased emic sample, biased ethic, okay, which are self-explanatory, non-biased emic or neutral emic, and non-biased ethic, etc. And we also have non-scientific ethic and non-scientific emic, which is not based on a scientific concept. Indeterminate emic, okay, viewpoints cannot be elicited or processed properly. For example, thought worlds of say sentinelist types cannot be understood directly. They can only be understood indirectly, but it may not be what do you say reliable. We have marginalized emic, which is a non-dominant emic point of view, which is to obtain in certain cases to understand suppressed or non-dominant points of view. Okay. Again, we have dominant emic, dominant etic, mutual emic etic loop also, where there is a continuous, what do you say, ratification. Okay. Self emic or auto emic, like autoethnography, person doing his own ethnography, and complex semi-kinetic relationships also can be formed. Okay, I have written, described all these things at a great level of detail. Please do go through my papers when you get the time. Okay, I have also written about cultural frame of reference and cross-cultural frame of reference. But what is a cultural frame of reference? A cultural frame of reference, as a layman would understand, is it is a complete set of ideals and ideas that an individual possesses that determines the way he or she looks at and interprets various aspects of the world and interprets them. A cultural frame of reference is very deep rooted, comprehensive, and dependent on the entire gamut of human experience, including processes of infiltration, exfiltration, or transfiltration, and can be understood through the techniques that were proposed. For example, the technique of ethnography of infiltration, for which we had dedicated an entire paper. Cross-cultural frame of reference, from our perspective, reference refer to the general perspectives across cultures. Okay, common denominator. We had also published a paper called Why the Alignment of Hypothesis Formulation Theorization with Cultural Cross-Cultural Frame of Reference is Required, colon, a rough guide to better hypothesis formulation theorizations. Okay, when you're developing a hypothesis or a theory, you need to understand how people are likely to process that information. Therefore, you need to uh, bring it out from their perspective in the interest of efficacy of cultural change. We had also written about concept of irreducible simplicity. Okay, irreducible complexity is pseudoscience. It is involved associated with Christian creationism. But I have written about irreducible simplicity. I had also written about continuous zero-based assessment of assumptions, hypotheses, and methods. I had also written about structured perception techniques of social-cultural change as a partial replacement for thematic apperception tests, social block tests. They were used in the study of Dutch East Indies, etc., long ago, several decades ago. But these are by and large obsolete and very iffy, dubious, notoriously unreliable. We are also argued that developing countries have their own unique set of problems and greater participation of researchers in developing countries is required. We had also written about hierarchical analysis, including top to bottom flow, elites to bottom of the pyramid, how values propagate, generational analysis, traced from the culture in general, group, subgroup, and then the individual. I had written about concepts such as inheritance, partial inheritance, inheritance with modification, direct inheritance from parent culture, indirect inheritance from grandparent culture, non-inheritance, single layered variation, multi layered variation, upward transmission of cultural values, etc. These are some of the concepts that I had already proposed. However, much greater research, much more detailed research is required to analyze behavioral analysis from cross-cultural perspectives. This is also required from a psychological standpoint because even in places such as Kerala, you have a large number of people going to psychiatrists. However, even psychology and psychiatry are being studied only from a Eurocentric mode. This needs to change, and we need to have a more cross-cultural approach. Because I'm not a sane psychiatrist or psychologist, I have however noticed that everything is still Western centric and Eurocentric. This needs to change, and this will have a ripple and cascading effect on many disciplines and on human health and human betterment as well. Thank you very much.